Chapter 1. A Visit to Fernwood House. If there was one thing the villagers of Linfield St. Mary could be relied upon to whisper about, it was Fernwood House. Set at the far edge of the village, where the neat hedgerows gave way to wilder lanes and older trees, Fernwood had once been the pride of the district, a Georgian manor of honeyed brick and graceful proportions. But that was many years ago. Its grandeur had faded, not into ruin, but into a state of genteel decay, the kind that made it more mysterious than decrepit. The ivy grew thicker each spring, the windows darkened a little more each year, and the air around it, so the more fanciful spinsters said, was tinged with something unfinished. Miss Jane Marple, never one to indulge in melodrama, would have described it rather more plainly. Fernwood House, she told her nephew Raymond one spring afternoon, is not so much haunted as it is haunting. There's a difference. It was on the occasion of the Easter luncheon, a quaint local custom organized by the Women's Guild, that Miss Marple found herself walking the long drive to Fernwood, her parasol neatly furled and her sensible shoes pressing down on the moss-speckled gravel. The luncheon was to be hosted this year by Mrs. Isabel Hartnell, the current mistress of Fernwood, who had inherited the house from her brother 5 years prior, and was widely believed to be holding it together on little more than inherited linen and iron will. Miss Marple had not visited Fernwood since before the war, but as she passed beneath the overgrown arch of wisteria and saw the sagging trellis that bordered the conservatory, she recalled, with a curious chill, how often the place had been whispered about even then, something to do with a cousin lost at sea, or a will contested and never spoken of again. Such things were seldom forgotten in villages like Linfield. Inside the house, the luncheon proceeded with expected awkwardness and charm. The long dining table had been polished to a dull sheen, and the place settings, faintly mismatched, spoke to the desperate rating of a rarely opened china cupboard. The meal itself was modest, but competent. Slices of cold ham, a coronation chicken salad, and something approximating a lemon syllabub. Around the table sat a small but intriguing gathering. Mrs. Hartnell, the hostess herself, in a stiff lilac blouse and wearing a brooch that looked suspiciously like a mourning piece. Canon Weatherby, a guest from the next parish, who seemed too fond of the elderflower wine. Miss Cordelia Drake, a visiting cousin with sharply drawn eyebrows and an unfortunate cough. Mr. Terence Blythe, a solicitor from London, rumored to be overseeing things for the Hartnell estate. Celia Tompkins, the young housemaid, clearly unused to serving guests and startled by every clatter. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the far end of the table, accepted her plate with a warm nod and watched everything and everyone. "I'm afraid Fernwood is rather out of sorts these days," Mrs. Hartnell was saying as she poured more tea. "I do what I can, of course, but it's simply too much for one woman." "Quite so," murmured Canon Weatherby, who had already reached for a second scone. "You've no household staff remaining, then?" asked Miss Marple mildly. "Only Celia," said Mrs. Hartnell, "and a gardener who comes in twice a week. The days of parlor-maids and footmen are quite over, I'm afraid." Miss Marple offered a smile, but her eyes lingered a moment on the girl in question. Celia Tompkins, no more than 19, with pale skin and a tremor in her hands that made the silver rattle on the tray as she passed. "She's very young," Miss Marple remarked gently. "Local," Mrs. Hartnell replied. "From Barton Heath, shy as a field mouse, but she's grateful for the work." Miss Cordelia Drake gave a sudden cough, a rasping, unpleasant sound, and dabbed at her mouth with a lace-edged handkerchief. "Your cousin is unwell?" Miss Marple inquired delicately. Cordelia gave a strained smile. "Old bronchial thing. The air in Fernwood doesn't help, I'm afraid. Too damp." "No ghosts, though," said Mr. Blythe with a smirk, cutting a wedge of sponge cake. "You'd expect more in a place like this." Mrs. Hartnell's smile faltered just slightly. "Fernwood may have its share of legends," she said crisply, "but we are quite without specters, at least the kind that walk." There was a pause, and in that pause, Miss Marple caught something, flickering like a shadow in the corner of the room, the look between Mrs. Hartnell and Cordelia, The slight glance exchanged, unremarkable to most. But in Miss Marple's experience, such things were never only glances. They were calculations, warnings. When the luncheon concluded, and the guests slowly drifted out into the overgrown garden to admire the daffodils, Miss Marple lingered near the drawing room, where a large oil painting of a man in naval uniform hung above the fireplace. She tilted her head. The brass plaque beneath it read, Captain Edwin Hartnell, 1897-1918. Your brother? She asked quietly, as Mrs. Hartnell joined her. The woman nodded. Lost in the Adriatic. Submarine attack. We never recovered the body. Miss Marple observed. The faint dust on the frame, not recent but neither neglected. Must be hard, she said softly. Never to have said goodbye properly. Mrs. Hartnell's voice was low. One never does, even when one has the chance. It was a curious thing to say. But before Miss Marple could reflect on it, Celia the housemaid gave a sudden cry from the hallway. When they rushed to the source of the noise, they found her in the narrow corridor near the servants' stairs, one hand clutched to her apron, the other pointing toward a half-open door. I didn't touch it, she stammered. It was open, and the light was on. I thought no one used the East Room anymore. Miss Marple moved gently past her and looked inside. The East Room was small and dark, the curtains drawn. But what caught the eye immediately was the old chaise by the window, draped in a thin cloth, and on it, something quite out of place. A small travel case, tan leather, monogrammed, and resting beside it, open and faintly fluttering in the breeze from the cracked window. A diary. Miss Marple stepped closer. The writing was shaky but readable. The date was recent, only 3 days prior, and the final line on the page read, I think she knows. She always watches the window. If I disappear, start in the garden. Miss Marple closed the book slowly. She turned to Celia. Dear, she said calmly, do be so kind as to fetch Mr. Blythe, and perhaps Canon Weatherby. I'm afraid Fernwood may not be quite so free of ghosts as we hoped. Chapter 2. The village reacts. By the next morning, news of the diary at Fernwood House had threaded itself into every corner of Linfield St. Mary. It began, of course, at Hargreaves's bakery, where Mrs. Bletchley, never one to let a fact go unembroidered, whispered to her neighbor that a body had been discovered, along with a secret will and a blood-stained pillow. This was entirely untrue, but as Miss Marple had often said, truth in a village is like cream. It rises eventually, but only after a great deal of skimming. The actual discovery, an old travel case and a diary left in an unused room, was odd enough without the embellishments. But it wasn't the objects themselves that disturbed people. It was the implication. Someone had been in that room, someone had written those words, and someone had left them behind, either as a cry for help or as a warning. At the vicarage, where Miss Marple was enjoying a quiet cup of tea with Reverend Linton and his wife Alice, the conversation inevitably turned to the matter. I never liked that house, said Alice, stirring her tea far too vigorously. Even as a girl, there was something hushed about it, as if one were always just too late to overhear a secret. The Reverend nodded. The Hartnell family has always been private, deeply so. But this diary, Jane, do you think it could be genuine? Miss Marple sipped her tea. I think someone wrote it, and that the fear it contained was not imagined. But whether the danger lies in the past or the present, I do not yet know. Alice leaned forward. Do you suppose it's about that cousin who vanished, Cordelia Drake? Miss Marple shook her head gently. No one has vanished. Not yet. Though Miss Drake did seem rather more frail than she claimed to be. And what of the solicitor? The Reverend added. Blythe, was it? He seemed more curious than concerned. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Solicitors are taught to conceal their reactions. It doesn't mean they aren't having them. Meanwhile, at Fernwood House, the atmosphere had curdled into a brittle civility. Celia, the maid, moved about with quiet dread, jumping at shadows, and teacups alike. Mrs. Hartnell had closed the east room again and declared the matter a strange prank, though her voice held the tremor of someone less convinced than she pretended to be. Cordelia Drake, having recovered from her fit of coughing, had taken to spending long hours in the conservatory, bundled in a shawl and sipping brandy from a teacup when she thought no one noticed. And Mr. Blythe? He had requested to stay on at the house to advise Mrs. Hartnell on matters of property security, though no one could recall him locking a single door. Miss Marple paid a visit that afternoon under the guise of returning a borrowed shawl. One Judith Linton had accidentally left at the luncheon, and which Miss Marple had volunteered to deliver. Mrs. Hartnell received her stiffly in the drawing room, the fire unlit and the curtains half drawn despite the midday sun. "I cannot imagine how the diary came to be there," she said, her hands tightly clasped. "It's an old room. We've barely opened it in years. And the travel case? It must have belonged to one of my late brother's guests," she said quickly. "Fernwood saw many visitors in those days." Miss Marple, seated primly on the edge of a fad armchair, said nothing. She only tilted her head. Mrs. Hartnell shifted uncomfortably. "The handwriting wasn't familiar to me." Miss Marple looked down at her knitting bag, withdrew a ball of wool, and began casting stitches. "No name in the diary either." "No. Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple mused. "How fear can be recorded without identity, as though the emotion alone is enough to prove something happened." Mrs. Hartnell did not reply. She stood abruptly. "Would you like some tea?" But before Miss Marple could answer, a door banged open in the hall, and Cordelia Drake appeared, her shawl hanging crookedly from one shoulder. "I told you it was unwise," she said sharply. "I said from the beginning that bringing in guests would stir things up." Mrs. Hartnell's face hardened. "Cordelia, not now." But Cordelia was not to be deterred. "You should have let Fernwood go years ago. All this, these secrets, it's been rotting beneath the wallpaper since before you were born." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "I wonder," she said softly, "if you're speaking metaphorically, or quite literally." Cordelia blinked, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Mrs. Hartnell stepped forward, her voice suddenly taut. "Forgive my cousin. She has moods." "I imagine she has memories," Miss Marple said quietly. Cordelia's eyes glistened. "He used to say the house would never let go, that it remembered. I didn't understand what he meant until—" She stopped, turned, and hurried out. Miss Marple stood. "I won't trouble you further," she said gently. "Thank you for the chat." Mrs. Hartnell offered no reply. Outside, the afternoon light filtered gently through the beech trees, and Miss Marple paused at the end of the long drive to look back at Fernwood House. The window stared blankly. Somewhere within its walls, something had been left unsaid for far too long. She walked back to the village slowly, past the grocer's, where Mrs. Bletchley now swore the diary contained a confession in code, and past the chemist's, where Mr. Hargreaves murmured to a customer that chloroform leaves no trace, you know. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. Something Cordelia had said lingered in her thoughts. He used to say the house would never let go. Who was he? Captain Edwin Hartnell, or someone else? Someone still alive, who had walked Fernwood's corridors recently enough to leave behind a bag, a diary, and a warning? She stopped at the post office and posted a note to an old friend in Bath, a former clerk in the probate court with an excellent memory for strange codicils and contested estates. If there had been a visitor to Fernwood unaccounted for, someone who'd been close enough to see something and frightened enough to hide it, Miss Marple would soon know. Until then, she would knit, and listen, and wait, and in the village, the whispers would continue to grow. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. Miss Marple, as the Reverend Linton once observed, was not a woman who asked questions. She simply invited answers. She had a way of sitting quite still, with a look of vague interest and innocent amusement, that made even the most reticent villagers begin to speak without realizing how much they'd said. That particular skill was now engaged in full. Her first stop after Sunday service was not Fernwood, but Rose Cottage, the modest home of Celia Tompkins's mother, a widow who took in mending and opinions with equal industriousness. The tea was weak, the jam homemade, and within 15 minutes Miss Marple knew everything Celia had never said aloud. She came home after the luncheon white as a sheet, Mrs. Tompkins said, smoothing her apron. Said she'd seen something. Not right. Wouldn't say what. But I know my Celia. She doesn't jump at shadows without cause. And has she said anything since? Miss Marple asked mildly, watching the sugar dissolve in her tea. Barely a word, except one thing. Yesterday morning, she muttered. It was open. That door was always locked before. Mrs. Tompkins paused. What do you think she meant? Miss Marple only smiled, as though the question were too clever for her. I suppose it could mean anything, she said softly. But perhaps Fernwood is full of doors long kept shut. Later that day, Miss Marple took a quiet walk to the churchyard, ostensibly to check the state of the creeping thyme that grew wild along the boundary wall. She encountered Canon Weatherby, who had returned for evensong and was pottering about the gravestones with the air of a man hoping to discover a historical scandal. Miss Marple, he called out cheerfully. Still puzzling over Fernwood, are you? She smiled demurely. Oh, I wouldn't call it puzzling. But it was a curious luncheon, wasn't it? The canon leaned conspiratorially on his walking stick. Very. Mrs. Hartnell doesn't strike me as the sort to host, frankly. A rather flinty woman, if you ask me. And that cousin, Cordelia, clearly unwell. Though it's the solicitor who's the real riddle. Terribly nosy fellow. Miss Marple nodded. Mr. Blythe. You spoke with him, I think. Briefly. Seemed very interested in the attic. Asked if the family had ever considered selling Fernwood, or converting it. Mentioned some syndicate in London. How enterprising, Miss Marple said. And did he know the house well? The canon blinked. That's just it. I assumed he'd been involved for years. He spoke like a man familiar with the property. But then later, he said it was his first visit. Miss Marple tucked that thought away. She always found contradictions more revealing than confirmations. She bid the canon goodbye and made her next call, by invitation, to the Fernwood drawing room, where Mr. Blythe himself had agreed to meet her for a short legal clarification. She arrived promptly, bringing a folded list of Women's Guild donations, purely a cover, of course, and was ushered into the room by Celia, whose pale face suggested a night spent far from restful. Mr. Blythe stood by the window, sleeves rolled to the elbow, holding a tumbler of water that he stirred absent-mindedly. Miss Marple, he said with a professional smile. Always a pleasure. I'm told you've a keen interest in parish records? She seated herself gently, arranging her skirt. I do dabble, she said with amusement. But what truly interests me is what people remember. I find memory to be far more revealing than ledgers. He raised an eyebrow. Take the day of the luncheon, she continued. You mentioned to Canon Weatherby that it was your first time visiting Fernwood, and yet I recall you telling Mrs. Hartnell that the stair balustrade had aged considerably, as though you had seen it before. Mr. Blythe smiled, but the expression was tight. I may have misspoken. I've dealt with so many country properties of late, they blur. I imagine it must be very busy work, Miss Marple said. And yet, you found time to remain here. After the luncheon, advising Mrs. Hartnell, was it? He shifted slightly. There are matters of probate. The estate is more entangled than it appears. So I gathered, Miss Marple said. Though it's odd, don't you think that Mrs. Hartnell hasn't mentioned a current case pending? Mr. Blythe stared at her, then shrugged. Perhaps it isn't my place to disclose. Miss Marple gave him her most grandmotherly smile. Of course not. But as she left the house and walked back toward the green, her mind was already lining up the inconsistencies. Blythe's claim of a first visit, his knowledge of the house's structure, his eagerness to stay on, yet no visible paperwork or files, and something else, his odd reaction to the diary. Others had shown concern, confusion, even fear, but Blythe had seemed amused. The next morning, a letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. It bore a tidy Bath postmark, and was signed by Clive Denner, a retired clerk she had written to days earlier. The contents were illuminating. Dear Miss Marple, in response to your inquiry, I can confirm that a Mr. Terence Blythe was indeed involved in a probate dispute regarding the Fernwood estate some 12 years ago. He represented a party contesting the will of one Edwin Hartnell, presumed deceased. The case was quietly dismissed when no new evidence surfaced. However, the identity of Blythe's client was never disclosed in court records, sealed on the E.I. family's request. Yours sincerely, Clive Denner. Miss Marple folded the letter and sat very still. Mr. Blythe had been at Fernwood before, not once, but long ago, and under quite different circumstances. And if he had returned now, coincidentally at the same time a diary surfaced warning of danger, it meant only one thing. He hadn't come to close the estate. He had come to reopen. That evening, she made one final call, back to Celia Tompkins. The girl, pale and nervous, answered the door with wide eyes. Miss Marple? She whispered. I didn't do anything wrong, I swear. I believe you, Miss Marple said kindly. But I think you saw someone enter the east room before the luncheon. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Celia hesitated. Then, in a small voice, I saw Mr. Blythe. Before anyone arrived. He had a key. He was putting something in the drawer. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The diary. The mystery was no longer who had written it, but who had placed it there and why, and perhaps most chilling of all, what they meant by the words, if I disappear, start in the garden. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By Thursday morning, the matter of Fernwood had taken hold of Linfield St. Mary like a sudden, unwanted chill, and with every passing hour the villagers became more certain of one thing. Mr. Terence Blythe was not who he claimed to be. At the post office, Mrs. Winchell announced that she had always thought his shoes far too shiny for someone truly rural. At the butcher's, Mr. Elcott remarked that Blythe had once declined brawn, which to some suggested either metropolitan decadence or guilt. Either would do. At the Crown, over a pint and a meat pie, Mr. Denby the gardener declared with finality that Blythe knew which way the Fernwood cellar opened, a detail no visitor could guess. Murmurs of approval followed. It was all dreadfully circumstantial, of course. But as Miss Marple often observed, villagers did not need evidence to assemble a suspect, only consensus. That morning, Constable Finch made his way up to Fernwood House, summoned not by any emergency but by a polite request from Mrs. Hartnell herself. The constable found her in the library with Cordelia Drake and, somewhat more reluctantly, Mr. Blythe. I won't have whispers turning into wildfire, said Mrs. Hartnell briskly. I know nothing of this diary, and if Mr. Blythe had a reason to enter that room, I'm sure he'll explain it. Mr. Blythe, seated in a winged armchair and tapping a folded newspaper against one knee, gave a tight smile. I'm not in the habit of justifying my movements, Constable, but if you must know, I had business with Mrs. Hartnell's late brother. Old business. I simply wanted to look through some of his papers, privately. There was no crime in that. Except, the room was locked, Cordelia murmured. Blythe's smile thinned. Old houses have keys in odd places. I found one. Nothing more sinister than that. Constable Finch scratched at his neck. Well, Mr. Blythe, the vicar's already asked that any legal inquiries regarding the estate go through the diocese. It's not that we suspect anything, we're just, well, trying to maintain order. Mrs. Hartnell gave a sharp nod. Yes, order. But Cordelia Drake's eyes had gone distant. Her cough, once a dramatic affectation, had quieted to a shallow wheeze. Miss Marple, who had not been invited but had nonetheless wandered in with a small basket of cuttings for the Fernwood garden, listened from the hallway just beyond the open door. She heard enough to know three things. First, Mr. Blythe had lied again. There had been no papers in the East Room, only the diary and the travel case, both of which appeared deliberately left, not discovered. Second, Mrs. Hartnell had defended him, publicly, but her tone suggested she was speaking more from duty than belief. And third, Cordelia Drake was frightened. Not in the way villagers feared scandal or embarrassment. No, this was something quieter, something lived in. Her eyes no longer searched for approval. They searched for exits. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to Canon Weatherby, whom she found uncharacteristically agitated in his study. "The whole thing is quite improper," he said, tossing a hymn book onto his desk. "There's talk of calling in the bishop." Miss Marple, ever calm, folded her hands. "You've known the Hartnells a long time, haven't you?" "Years. Edwin was a fine man, distant but principled. And Isabel, well, she's built entirely out of old timber. And guilt, I suspect. And Cordelia?" The canon hesitated. "She was always fragile, quiet but oddly intense. Used to disappear for hours when she stayed here as a girl. Said the house made her feel watched." "Did she ever mention anyone watching her? In particular?" "No. But once, she asked if ghosts could wear shoes." Miss Marple blinked. "Shoes?" "She said she heard footsteps outside her door every night, and that they always stopped when she breathed too loudly." The canon gave a short, embarrassed laugh. "We dismissed it as nerves, but now I wonder." Miss Marple said nothing. She was thinking about Cordelia's sudden cough, her deep discomfort, and the years she had spent in proximity to Fernwood's shadows. It wasn't the diary that had spooked her. It was the return of something she thought long buried. Something or someone still alive. By evening, the consensus around Mr. Blythe had hardened: a solicitor with no papers, a history with the estate, a lie about being new to Fernwood. He was the obvious suspect. So obvious, in fact, that Miss Marple found herself doubting it, and that, in her experience, was when the real danger began. That night, she sat with her knitting beside the fire and wrote a letter. Not to the probate office this time, but to Miss Amanda Carleton, an old acquaintance who had once worked as a nurse at a sanatorium in Oxfordshire. Miss Marple remembered with absolute clarity that Cordelia Drake had once been sent to such a place, briefly, and without any public mention. She asked only one question: "Do you recall a Miss Cordelia Drake? If so, was there ever mention of a Mr. Edwin Hartnell?" She sealed the letter and set it aside. Then she closed her eyes. The East Room, the diary, the missing case, the handwriting, shaky, frightened. "If I disappear, start in the garden." Why, the garden? She remembered what Cordelia had said. He said the house would never let go. But what if the danger had not been the house, but someone within it? And what if the house, Fernwood, had merely played its role, sheltering, concealing, waiting? The next morning she returned to Fernwood under the pretense of delivering more cuttings, hydrangeas this time, her favorite excuse. Mrs. Hartnell received her with visible tension, but allowed her in. Cordelia was not present. Miss Marple wandered briefly toward the back hall, feigning confusion about the kitchen's location, and passed through the old conservatory. Beyond the glass, the garden stretched wild and tangled, and then she saw it. Near the edge of the hedge, half obscured by brambles, stood an old greenhouse, its windows fogged with age, its door unlatched. No one had mentioned the greenhouse. Not once. She stepped closer, the scent of earth and overripe foliage strong in the air. Inside, the shelves were covered in old pots, broken cloches, and a scattering of dried herbs. And in the far corner, beneath a moldy canvas, she saw a shallow hollow in the floor, lined in stone. It had once been a root cellar. Now it was empty. But not long ago, something had been placed there. Hidden. Or perhaps someone. Miss Marple stood very still. Then she turned and made her way back toward the house. The true suspect, she now believed, had been overlooked not because they had fled suspicion, but because they had always appeared too fragile to warrant it. But fragility, as she well knew, was a clever disguise. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. It was in the late afternoon, while trimming the edge of her back garden with her usual precision, that Miss Marple recalled something, an oddly specific detail that had barely registered at the time. It had not come from Mrs. Hartnell, nor from Mr. Blythe, nor from Constable Finch's account. It had come from Celia Tompkins, the maid. "I didn't touch it," she had said, trembling at the threshold of the east room. The light was on. It was the kind of thing no one questioned. In a house like Fernwood, where electricity flickered and wall sconces came alive with unpredictable voltage, such a statement passed without interest. But now, kneeling in her hydrangeas with the smell of fresh soil in the air, Miss Marple understood what had been wrong. There were no electric lights in the east wing. The wiring didn't extend that far. Mrs. Hartnell had said so herself at the luncheon, something about rewiring being prohibitively expensive beyond the main hall and bedrooms. The east rooms were unused and unlit, except for the fireplace and an old oil lamp, so if Celia had seen light, it hadn't come from the walls. It had come from within. Miss Marple didn't return to Fernwood at once. She spent the next morning asking questions under the pleasant guise of a village stroll, though her pace was more deliberate than usual. Her first stop was the ironmonger's, where she inquired about oil for garden tools, and then casually asked Mr. Phipps if anyone had purchased lamp oil in recent weeks. "Not often," he said, scratching his neck. "Mostly folks use paraffin now, or those little battery lanterns. But someone bought oil about a fortnight ago. A woman." "Not Mrs. Hartnell? No. This one was pale, sharp-featured, looked rather like one of those spinster missionaries you used to see in the back of the Illustrated London News." Miss Marple nodded. "Would that have been Miss Drake, by any chance?" Mr. Phipps blinked. "Yes, that's her. Came in just before closing. Odd thing, she paid in half-crowns. Told me she didn't trust the new coinage." Miss Marple thanked him and continued on. Oil lamps, sealed rooms, and a diary that warned of disappearance. Cordelia Drake, once painted as delicate and uncertain, had just stepped closer to the center of the mystery. But why now? What had caused her to leave a warning, if indeed it was hers? At the vicarage, Miss Marple sat with Alice Linton and gently steered the conversation from rhubarb yields to Fernwood matters. The vicar's wife, though not a woman of malice, was incapable of keeping a well-brewed pot of gossip to herself. "I still think it's Blythe," Alice said, pouring tea. "He has that slippery look, and he watches Celia far too often." "And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "he's hardly been alone in the house, nor has he taken any steps to leave. Perhaps he's waiting to inherit something," Alice speculated. Miss Marple offered a small smile. "And Cordelia? What do you make of her?" Alice hesitated. "She frightens me, a little. Not in the usual sense. She's never unkind. But there's a stillness to her, as if she's waiting to hear something, or stop something." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Later, as she walked home, a letter waited for her on the gatepost, hand-delivered, not mailed. The envelope was unmarked, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Neat, shaky, and slanted downward, a dot. Handwriting shaped by years of strain. She opened it there beside the hedge, the spring wind ruffling the page. "Miss Marple, I think you already know, but I cannot say it aloud. I saw something once, years ago in the garden by the greenhouse, a night I was told to forget, but it came back and he came with it. I put the diary there because I feared he might return. And now he has. He never truly left. I didn't mean to frighten anyone, but you must look again beneath the stones. Please come after dark. The house is watching." Miss Marple folded the letter and held it between her fingers for a moment, listening to the wind in the hedgerows. Cordelia Drake had not merely been a witness. She had been a prisoner of something that happened long ago. And now, she was inviting Miss Marple to uncover it fully. That evening, just as dusk fell, and the bells of St. Aldhelm's tolled 6, Miss Marple returned to Fernwood with a shawl over her shoulders and a lantern in her hand. She did not go to the front, or instead, she followed the garden path along the hedge, past the stone bench, and toward the greenhouse. It looked different in the failing light, less forgotten, more expectant. She pushed open the rotting door and stepped inside. The air was damp and still. Insects clicked beneath leaves, and the scent of moss clung to the walls. She went straight to the stone-lined hollow in the far corner, crouching where the earth looked disturbed. She reached for her trowel and carefully scraped at the soil. Within a few minutes, her fingers brushed something solid, metal. She unearthed it slowly. It was a tin box, rusted at the edges, the lid barely holding. Inside were several yellowed photographs, a faded scarf, and a small brooch shaped like a fern leaf, and, tucked beneath them, folded twice, was a document, a will. Signed, Edwin Hartnell. Dated, January 1918. But this was not the version Mrs. Hartnell had spoken of. This one bequeathed Fernwood House to Cordelia Drake, his niece, not to his sister. Miss Marple sat very still, the wind, moaning softly through the broken glass panes. Now she understood. Cordelia had once been the rightful heir, but the will had been hidden, buried quite literally, and someone had made sure she never knew, until now. Miss Marple returned to her cottage well after dark and placed the tin box carefully on the mantel. Blythe had returned, yes, but not for justice, and Mrs. Hartnell's inheritance so long held was never truly hers. But most troubling of all, the warning in the diary had not yet come true. If I disappear, start in the garden. Cordelia had not disappeared, yet, which meant someone, somewhere, was preparing to make her vanish before the truth could fully surface. And Miss Marple, already knitting the final threads in her mind, knew it was time for one last move. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. By Friday morning, a storm gathered over Linfield St. Mary, not in the sky but in the air between people. Conversations grew clipped, glances sharper. Even the birdsong seemed quieter, as though nature too held its breath. At Fernwood House, the atmosphere had turned brittle. Miss Marple arrived just before noon with a parcel of cuttings wrapped in brown paper. Mrs. Hartnell received her in the drawing room, pale-lipped and taut. "I hope you won't mind me saying, Jane," she began, placing a teacup with more force than necessary. "But this constant attention from the village is wearing." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Curiosity always finds its way to the door, Isabel, especially when something's been left unanswered." Mrs. Hartnell's mouth twitched, but she said nothing. "I visited the greenhouse last night," Miss Marple added, her tone still mild. "I found a will, one that names Cordelia Drake as the heir to Fernwood." Silence. It was not the pause of confusion. It was the pause of someone deciding whether to lie. When Mrs. Hartnell finally spoke, her voice was brittle. "I knew there had been alternative documents, but the matter was closed years ago." "Hidden," Miss Marple corrected softly. Mrs. Hartnell's knuckles whitened around her teacup. "My brother was not in his right mind. He wrote many drafts. He entrusted the final version to me. I did what was best for the estate, for the family." Miss Marple gave a slight nod as if she understood, and in a way, she did. But she also knew that justifying a secret rarely erased its damage. At that moment, the drawing room door opened, and Cordelia stepped in. She was pale, her eyes rimmed in shadow, but she carried herself with an unfamiliar resolve. There was no coughing today, no tremble in her voice. "I know," she said. Both women turned to look at her. "I know what he left me. I found the document once, years ago, and I hid it again." Miss Marple looked at her calmly. "Why?" "Because I was 14, Cordelia said. "And my aunt told me if I claimed it, I would be cast out, that I was unstable, that the house would consume me." Mrs. Hartnell's face darkened. "That's not what I said." "You implied it," Cordelia replied, her voice steady. "And I believed you." Miss Marple rose slowly, brushing the creases from her skirt. "There's something I've learned in life," she said quietly. "Secrets grow like ivy. You think they're covering something up, but really, they're pulling it down." Cordelia looked down. "He wasn't just my uncle, he was the only person who ever told me I mattered." There was a silence then, deeper than any argument. Mrs. Hartnell turned her face toward the window. "I did what I thought was right," she said quietly. "I kept Fernwood alive, maintained the house, paid the staff, protected the name." "But you didn't protect me," Cordelia replied. Miss Marple watched them both for a moment. Then, gently, she said, "You know, there's something rather curious about that diary." Cordelia blinked. "What do you mean?" "The handwriting. You said you left it. But the final entry, it was different. The slope of the letters changed, the spelling shifted. And most telling of all, it ended with a phrase you never used aloud." Cordelia's eyes widened. "Then I didn't write it." "No," said Miss Marple. "You wrote the first entries, but someone else finished it." She turned to Mrs. Hartnell. "I believe that person wanted to frighten you." Cordelia's voice dropped to a whisper. "Aunt Isabel?" But Mrs. Hartnell shook her head. "I would never. Not frighten you, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Frighten her." They both turned, to the maid standing just outside the door. "Celia." She stepped into the room, her apron rumpled, her face oddly calm. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said quietly. "But I wanted her to leave." Cordelia stared. "You wrote the last entry?" "I knew about the will," Celia said. "I heard them, Mrs. Hartnell and Mr. Blythe, arguing one night. About what to do if you found it, about keeping it buried." Cordelia looked to her aunt, whose face had gone very still. "You lied," she whispered. "I protected you," Mrs. Hartnell said, voice hollow. Celia continued, "I thought, if she was frightened enough, she'd run. I didn't know she'd go to Miss Marple." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You were afraid she would take Fernwood." "I grew up here," Celia said. "My mother worked here before me. This house is all I've ever known. If she inherited it, if it changed hands, I'd be out." Miss Marple sighed. "Fear makes us do small things," she said, "but also cruel things." Celia looked down. "I'm sorry, Miss Drake." Cordelia nodded once, but her face remained unreadable. Mrs. Hartnell stood now, hands shaking. "It's all unraveling," she murmured. "All these years and now it's gone." Miss Marple stepped forward. "Not gone, Isabel, but perhaps finally honest." She turned to Cordelia. "There's still the matter of the will, but that's for a solicitor, not for this room." Cordelia nodded. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And I believe there's someone in the village who would be more impartial than Mr. Blythe." That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and watched the sun set over the hedgerows. The air was quiet, heavy with the scent of lilac and soil. She sat in her chair by the hearth and opened her diary. Fernwood House was never cursed. It was only wounded. Some houses are kept alive not by bricks and wood, but by truths finally spoken aloud. Outside, the bells of St. Aldhelm's rang gently across the fields, and at Fernwood, a window opened, for the first time in years. Chapter 7. Another twist. 2 days had passed since the confrontation in the drawing room of Fernwood House. In village, it felt like 2 months. For once, Linfield St. Mary was quiet. The shops returned to normal chatter. The gossip about Fernwood turned reflective, half regretful, half smug. Miss Cordelia Drake, many agreed, had proven surprisingly dignified. Mrs. Hartnell, while not forgiven, was granted the faint absolution that came with the words, "She meant well." Celia, it seemed, had slipped into invisibility again, and Mr. Blythe had left the village abruptly, his departure noted only by a single unsent letter found in the vicarage bin, addressed to no one. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. It was all too neatly resolved, a little too convenient. And if there was one thing Miss Marple had learned over her long and observant life, it was that human affairs seldom concluded tidily unless someone had designed them to. It wasn't until a damp Sunday morning that the thread appeared, delivered, not by a suspect or a witness, but by young Freddie Cossington, the grocer's boy. She was walking home from the vicarage when he ran up, red-cheeked and panting, waving a scrap of paper in his hand. "Miss Marple, Mum said to bring you this. Said I wasn't to read it, but I saw the name Fernwood, and I thought you might want to know straight away." She took the folded page with a kind smile and read it carefully, her brow furrowing as the words, "Unfolded. Found this in the shed behind the greenhouse. Looks like it's been there years. You'll know what to do with it. Can't have this sort of thing turning up now the Drake girl's making plans. Please don't mention me. A friend attached." By a paperclip was a second item, a faded, torn page from what appeared to be an old-school notebook. The ink had run, but parts of it remained legible. Told me not to say anything about what I saw. He was in the garden, standing over something. It was like a trunk, half buried. I think it was moving. He saw me and said if I breathed a word, he'd say it was me who dug it up. I didn't want to, but I dream about... The girl in the scarf. She looked at me like she knew. I'm scared she'll come back. No name, no date. But Miss Marple's heart had begun to pound. The girl in the scarf. She recalled the contents of the rusted tin box she had found in the greenhouse, a scarf, photographs, and a brooch. Cordelia had not recognized the scarf, but someone else had. Miss Marple turned and walked with deliberate speed back toward Fernwood. Mrs. Hartnell was not at home, nor was Cordelia. Celia, it seemed, had taken the day off, but the key, as Miss Marple knew, was still hidden in the flower pot beneath the cracked stone urn by the side entrance. A village trick so common it hardly counted as trespassing. Inside, Fernwood felt oddly still. Not quiet, still. The kind of stillness that follows a storm and precedes a reckoning. Miss Marple did not pause in the foyer or drawing room. She went straight to the library and then into the narrow corridor that led to the old servant wing. At the end of that corridor was a door she'd noticed once before, unmarked and warped with age. She opened it now. The small room beyond had once been a nursery, she thought. There was a built-in cupboard, a fireplace long since sealed, and a single high window. Dust blanketed everything, but on the floor, half hidden beneath a moth-eaten rug, was the imprint of a trunk. And just beside it, carved into the wood of the skirting board, were initials C.M. Miss Marple stared. Celia's full name, she recalled, was Celia Margaret Tompkins. But Celia hadn't been born when this carving was made. That room hadn't been used in decades. She stepped back out and closed the door. The diary warning had said, "Start in the garden." But the origin of what had happened, the true beginning, had been inside the house all along. Miss Marple returned home and wrote a single note, folded it and walked it to the vicarage. Reverend Linton read it slowly, paled, and nodded. "I'll call the constable," he said, "and we'll begin searching the foundations, quietly." That night, beneath the floor of the old nursery, they found the remains of a trunk, rotted through with time. Inside were scraps of fabric, bone, and a single rusted bracelet bearing the initials A.R. Miss Marple remembered the village records. A housemaid had gone missing from Fernwood in 1918, the same year Edwin Hartnell died. Her name had been Agnes Rowley. The scandal had been hushed, the disappearance uninvestigated. Edwin's death, by enemy fire in the Adriatic, had drawn attention away. But the truth had remained. Agnes had not run off. She had been buried. Miss Marple stood beside the dug-up foundation and felt a chill pass through her bones. The will hadn't been buried to disinherit Cordelia. It had been buried because someone had murdered the girl who witnessed its signing. Cordelia hadn't known. Neither had Mrs. Hartnell. Only one person had ever alluded to the basement, the garden, the girl in the scarf, the anonymous page. The hand that wrote it had been young then, but older now, which meant the answer lay not with the old generation, but with someone who had grown up carrying the truth and had stayed silent out of fear. Miss Marple thought of Celia, not guilty, no, but connected, and perhaps still in danger, because now the past was not only unearthed, it was coming to collect. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The next morning arrived damp and slow, with a fine mist clinging to the hedgerows like a whispered warning. Miss Marple rose early, lit her fire, and laid out the contents of the rusted tin box once more, carefully setting the faded scarf, the bracelet, the will, and the yellowed photographs in a neat row across her writing desk. She studied them with an expression of quiet concentration, like a seamstress reviewing thread before mending a particularly delicate tear. Then, with deliberate care, she removed the bracelet, the one marked AR, and slipped it into her reticule. It was time. 10 o'clock sharp, she returned to Fernwood House, greeted at the door by a weary Mrs. Hartnell. Cordelia was absent. She'd gone into the village to speak with the solicitor Miss Marple had recommended. Celia, however, was in the drawing room, seated in a high-backed chair, with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes flicked toward the doorway with a kind of practiced neutrality, as though waiting for something but determined not to appear eager. Miss Marple entered with her usual unhurried grace and placed her bag gently on the table. "I thought," she said cheerfully, "that I might return something that belongs to the house." She reached into her bag and retrieved the bracelet, holding it delicately by the chain. "Do you recognize this, dear?" she asked Celia, her tone light and seemingly innocent. Celia's eyes darted toward it, then away. "No," she said quickly. "Should I?" Miss Marple gave a little sigh. "I rather thought you might. You see, it was found beneath the floorboards, along with what remained of Agnes Rowley." Mrs. Hartnell drew a sharp breath. Celia paled but held her composure. "I don't understand," she said. "That name, Agnes, I don't know who that is." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Perhaps not directly, but I wonder, did your mother ever speak of Fernwood's old staff, the women who worked here before the war?" Celia hesitated. "She mentioned a few. Names I barely remember. Why?" "Because Agnes Rowley was one of them," Miss Marple said gently. "And she vanished in 1918. A disappearance no one investigated very thoroughly, likely dismissed as a flighty girl running off with a soldier." She paused, then added, "But she didn't run. She was buried here, beneath the nursery floor." Mrs. Hartnell had gone quite still. Celia's hands folded in her lap had begun to tremble slightly. "I think," Miss Marple continued, "someone in this house saw what happened, or heard something they were told to forget, and I think that memory stayed with them, like a splinter under the skin." Still, Celia said nothing. So Miss Marple changed tack. "There was a child here then, a boy perhaps, a playmate of Cordelia's, or a cousin, someone who came and went but knew the rhythms of Fernwood. He may have stumbled on something in the garden, a trunk, a body. Perhaps he was told to keep quiet." Celia looked up now, her lips parting slightly. Miss Marple's voice softened. "Did your mother ever tell you who your father was?" Mrs. Hartnell gasped. "Miss Marple." But Celia was already standing. "No," she said quietly. "She never did." Miss Marple nodded. "I think it was someone who worked here, perhaps even someone tied to the Hartnells, and I think your mother knew the danger of that connection. That's why she stayed close to Fernwood, why she raised you in its shadow. You've lived your whole life feeling as though something was owed, and perhaps it was." Celia's face was pale, her eyes glistening. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," she whispered, "but I hated how they looked at me, like I didn't belong, like I was something they'd rather forget." Miss Marple stepped forward and took her hand. "You do belong, Celia, but not by hiding what happened. Agnes deserves to be remembered, and you deserve the truth." Mrs. Hartnell rose now, her voice strained. "My brother, he had a temper, but I never thought—" "You knew he was keeping things from you," Miss Marple said gently. "But you looked away." There was a long silence. Finally, Celia sat back down. "I wrote part of the diary," she admitted. "The ending. I thought, if Cordelia left, Fernwood would be safe again, that nothing else would change. But someone else wrote the beginning," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone who saw what happened long ago. Someone who might have left this village years ago. Or never left at all." Mrs. Hartnell looked stricken. "Then who?" Miss Marple turned to her slowly. Your brother didn't just bury the will. He buried a girl. And someone helped him. Mrs. Hartnell's eyes widened. You can't mean... Mr. Blythe, Miss Marple said. She opened her bag again and produced a letter, newly delivered from Bath that morning. Miss Marple, your instincts were correct. Terence Blythe worked briefly as a clerk in London before the war. He was never a solicitor, not officially. But he did spend time on country estates, including Fernwood, where he was listed as a family assistant under Edwin Hartnell's name in 1917. More troubling, he was questioned in 1920 in connection with a missing girl, though no charges were filed. I'd be very cautious. Your faithful, Amanda C. Miss Marple folded the letter. He returned not to settle the estate, but to ensure it remained buried. Once the diary surfaced, he knew the past was rising. He hoped to reclaim whatever leverage he'd once had. Mrs. Hartnell sat heavily, her eyes unfocused. But it's over, Miss Marple said gently. Agnes will have a name. Cordelia will inherit the house. And Celia, she turned to the maid, will have her place, not as a shadow in the corner, but as someone who endured and remained. Celia's tears spilled over, but she nodded. Outside, the mist had lifted. Sunlight broke through the clouds like a quiet blessing. Miss Marple stepped to the window, watching the garden sway in the breeze, and somewhere beneath the soil, truth stirred in its long sleep. Chapter 9. The reveal. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple returned to the drawing room at Fernwood House, this time with no pretense of gardening clippings or social visits. Instead, she had asked that all parties be present. Cordelia Drake, now seated beside the hearth with a quiet steel. In her posture, Mrs. Isabel Hartnell upright and brittle as ever, hands folded tightly in her lap, and Celia Tompkins, whose face bore the fragile calm of someone who had come through a storm and was still unsure whether the sky would darken again. The mood in the room was heavy with expectation. Outside, the spring light slanted through the lace curtains, casting faint bars across the carpet. Miss Marple stood near the window, the rusted tin box beside her on a side table, the scarf, bracelet, and will all laid out like relics from an unearthed past. I appreciate your patience, she began gently. But I believe it's time to lay everything to rest. Truthfully, completely, and without further whisper. Cordelia sat, forward. I know what the will means now, that I was meant to inherit Fernwood, that Uncle Edwin intended it. Yes, Miss Marple said, but the will was hidden, not merely out of spite or jealousy, but to conceal something darker. Something that I believe your aunt only began to suspect after your uncle's death. Mrs. Hartnell did not speak. Her eyes were fixed on the will. Miss Marple continued. In 1918, a housemaid named Agnes Rowley disappeared. It was assumed she had left in haste, but she had not. She had been killed and buried under the floor of the old nursery. Cordelia's eyes flicked to Celia, then back to Miss Marple. But who? Edwin Hartnell, Miss Marple said softly, though the truth, as always, is layered. I don't believe he was a monster. I believe he was frightened, by the war, by the shifting world, by his own guilt. She looked at Mrs. Hartnell. And I believe, Isabel, that you suspected something. Perhaps not then, but later. You may have found the will. You may have questioned why it vanished. But you were too loyal to Fernwood, to the family name, to voice what you feared. Mrs. Hartnell's mouth opened, then closed again. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. There was blood, in the nursery, once, just a little. He said it was an accident, broken glass, but the maid was gone the next day, and he burned her apron in the garden stove. Cordelia's face turned pale. Miss Marple nodded slowly. You knew then, but you chose silence, and that silence grew. She turned now to Celia. And years later, your mother, once a young kitchen maid, raised you here. I believe she knew the story too, perhaps not all of it, but enough. She kept you close to Fernwood, perhaps to watch over it, or perhaps because she feared what might happen if she let go. Celia said nothing. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "It was you," Cordelia said, turning to her. "You wrote the final diary entry." Celia nodded. "Only the last page. I wanted you to leave. I was afraid you'd find what had been buried, figuratively and literally. I didn't know you'd go to Miss Marple," Miss Marple interjected. "But the first part of the diary, those entries were older, written years ago by someone else, likely a boy who had been a guest here or even a relative, a child who saw something and was silenced." She paused. "I suspect Mr. Blythe knew that boy. May have even helped cover it up. He returned to ensure it stayed buried. But the house had begun to remember. And so had you, Cordelia." Cordelia looked stunned. "Me?" "The scarf," Miss Marple said. "You didn't recognize it, but you'd once seen it, perhaps as a child, glimpsed in the greenhouse, perhaps on a woman who vanished from your memory but not your dreams. You were never told what happened, but you felt it." Mrs. Hartnell spoke then, her voice breaking. "I was trying to protect the house, my brother, even Cordelia. If she'd inherited Fernwood, all of it would have come out. And so I kept it. I thought if I bore the burden, it would spare everyone else." Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. "But you weren't alone in bearing it. Celia bore it. Cordelia bore it. Even the house bore it." There was a long silence. Then Cordelia stood, walked to the tin box, and picked up the bracelet. "Agnes Rowley," she said. "She deserves a name. And a grave." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "And Fernwood deserves its peace." Later that evening, the police were quietly informed. The remains were handed over to the local constabulary with no press involved. Reverend Linton arranged for a burial service, to be held without public announcement, but with dignity. Agnes Rowley's name was carved into a modest stone, placed in a quiet corner of the churchyard. Miss Marple stood beside the grave alone for a moment before the others arrived. "It took them long enough, didn't it, my dear?" she murmured. "But you're not forgotten now." Behind her, Cordelia and Celia approached. They stood together, two women shaped by the same house, by different silences, and said nothing. There was nothing left to say, only the wind, soft, through the trees, and the slow tolling of the bell. That night, in her diary, Miss Marple wrote, "The truth did not come all at once. It never does. It arrived in pieces, in voices too long ignored, in warnings disguised as whispers." Fernwood House is no longer silent. It has remembered, and it has been heard. Then she set her pen down, poured herself a cup of tea, and resumed her knitting. The past had been laid to rest, but Miss Marple knew, somewhere, another silence was already stirring. Chapter 10. Aftermath spring arrived. In earnest in Linfield St. Mary the following week. Daffodils bobbed gently in the hedgerows, and the air carried the soft, hopeful scent of turned soil and distant blossoms. The village, having done what it always did, survived a scandal without ever quite admitting it had occurred, returned to its rhythms with delicate care. The events at Fernwood House were no longer the subject of whispers so much as a collective, cautious hush. Agnes Rowley had been laid to rest with quiet dignity. No announcements were made, and no reporters came. The service had been brief, attended by only a few: Miss Marple, the Reverend, Cordelia, Celia, and, unexpectedly, Mrs. Hartnell. She had stood silently throughout, black gloves folded over a prayer book she did not open. No one offered speeches, only silence, and perhaps for the first time it was honest. Fernwood House itself did not change overnight. The windows remained shuttered in the east wing, and the ivy had not yet been cut back. But the energy within had softened. Cordelia, with the newly validated will in hand, had decided not to evict her aunt. Mrs. Hartnell would remain in the west rooms for as long as she wished. There was no bitterness in the arrangement, only the kind of worn understanding that forms between people who have survived something wordless together. Celia, for her part, stayed on as housekeeper, not as a maid. She had asked for that title, with unusual firmness, and Cordelia had agreed without hesitation. There were boundaries now, mutual ones. Miss Marple had once said that Fernwood was not haunted. It was haunting. But it was no longer either. It had become, at last, simply quiet. On a bright Thursday morning, Miss Marple received an envelope in the post. Inside was a single photograph, a young woman in an old-fashioned apron, standing on the garden path at Fernwood, smiling faintly toward the camera. A name was written on the back in delicate script, Agnes Rowley, 1897–1918. No note accompanied it, but Miss Marple knew who had sent it. She placed it in the drawer beside her bed, beneath her reading spectacles and beside a dried sprig of lavender. Then, she returned to her garden, trimming back the rosebush with practiced care. At midday, her niece's letter arrived from Eastbourne, filled with tales of bridge clubs and an overzealous new curate. At tea, she joined Alice Linton for a quiet cup by the vicarage garden. They did not speak of Fernwood. They did not need to, because the house now stood not as a mystery, but as a memory. And in Linfield, that was enough. That evening, Miss Marple wrote one final entry in her diary. Some stories take years to speak. Others wait for a voice kind enough to listen. Agnes Rowley waited. So did Cordelia. So perhaps did I. The silence at Fernwood was never about ghosts. It was about shame. About women told to forget, and the long breath they hold when no one believes them. Now Fernwood breathes again. And so, I think, can we. She closed the book. Outside, the wind rustled gently through the evening air. Somewhere down the lane, a dog barked once and was quiet. The sky turned lavender over the hedgerows. Miss Marple, her knitting folded neatly beside her, poured herself a final cup of tea and looked out the window toward the hills. There would be more mysteries, more secrets, dressed in Sunday clothes, but for now all was still, and Fernwood at last was at peace.